think now we have reached that time when we discussed this issue about gene drive and how we can scale it up in Africa and elsewhere. And you have heard from the panel about what they do and what is actually happening. And I'll ask them question by question, and maybe if you feel that maybe you can be able to chip in on that, then you'll be able to talk about that. And I'll start this question with Dixon. Dixon, you said that you are working on transmission zero. Maybe people don't understand what transmission zero is, but I think you can explain a little bit that and what that means. But the question that I want to ask you, how did you come to discover the transmission zero? And we heard this morning from Professor Okumu here that you developed it in Ivakara. Can you please shed more light on this and tell us exactly how this tool was developed there and how you're moving on that?
Thank you very much. So Transmission Zero is a global collaborative program between Imperial College London, UK, and Ifakara Health Institute in Tanzania, as well as National Institute for Medical Research in Tanzania, and the Swiss Tropical Public Health Institute in Switzerland. At times people say, why transmission zero? It should be zero transmission. But transmission zero actually carries the message on the kind of modification we're working on. We are trying to immunize mosquitoes. So basically making mosquitoes not to have ability to kill malaria parasite. So we are envisaging that at times that technology will be out there. You will still have mosquitoes, of course, flying around, but those mosquitoes won't have ability to kill the parasite. So people say, why don't you kill them? I guess, as I said, this also we have other tools around, like Bennett. We still believe those mosquitoes will be challenged by Bennett like other mosquitoes out there. You also highlighted on how did we manage to do it. So it was in 2023 in March, where we publicized that we have made a genetically modified mosquitoes for the first time in Africa by Africans. That was a deliberate effort of making sure that you establish all the necessary infrastructure on the ground. You train people from the entire process of injecting the embryos with those molecules, and then do the screening, do the layering, maintaining the genetic stability within the modification. Those are deliberate. And to do that, people were supposed to be trained. And the way we did that is actually via this collaboration. We had some technical people from Imperial who've been working on this technology for years, of course. And they came, they stayed with us in Ifakara. They trained the people on the ground on how to do this entire pipeline of creating genetic modified mosquitoes. And with that, it comes, it's necessitated the institute also to establish some important frameworks like Institution Biosafety Committee, which is required, or is a requirement for any institution working on this technology to have, because it has to be regulated at institution level before it goes to the government. And the other aspect, which has been quite instrumental for us to continue moving forward, is the engagement that is also highlighted. And we've been getting enough support, even at this stage of development, from the government in terms of them start thinking what an important instrument and framework that will support the uptake of this technology in future. So basically that's that's sort of what has been a catalyst for us in Accra, but on the background, there's so many other support from the government to make sure that we do the right thing. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I'll come back to you for more clarity on that. Now I turn up to my friend Jonathan. I think you have been working in Uganda for a long time on the target malaria, on suppression constructs that has been developed by Austin. And Devontre, you have said that it is not easy really to follow the WHO guidelines on how you use first stages of clinical trials. And so I believe you are experiencing a lot of challenges in all that, and possibly you can tell us exactly where you are on that and how is the response from the communities and what kind of challenges are you experiencing?
Thank you, Charles. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, so it's been a long road. Yeah, we've taken a lot of time, but that's because we need to be sure at every stage that our assumptions are made and not proceed until, of course, we are comfortable that that's the best. So in terms of the design, the ideal clinical trial design that I'm talking about, of course, we always seek for the best. So we have to think of a trial design, because this is what we are going to propose to the regulators as our plan to test the efficacy in the field. So we are very aware that there are lots of experts out there, and so whatever we come up with needs to be technically sound, scientifically sound, and of course it can pass, great scrutiny. But the problem we are having is that ours is a first in the class type of technology, so no one has done this before, so you can't just go into the books or papers and say, okay, we're going to do like, those other people did. So it's something that you face when you're pioneering. And of course, our team is in that role. And so for us, it's always going to take longer because a lot of things we have to, develop them essentially, from scratch. So even when it comes to coming up with a trial design, it's lots of discussions, lots of proposals. And of course, our teams abroad, like Austin said, we have people who dedicated or who are experienced modelers. They can look at the modeling part and look at feasibility for what a trial design like this would entail and the resources you would need, maybe the sensitivity and the power that you need to make conclusions from. And of course, there are other resources out there. Groups like the FNIH, they've also convened forums where we've been part of, and experts have been brought on to really talk about a trial design, for GenBio. How could it look like? And a lot of thoughts, have been shared along those forums. So we've taken all that, and that's what we are planning to put together. We haven't quite finished it, but hopefully our finished trial design, I think, will be adequate and enough to test and look at the endpoints that we think, that are critical. So maybe in a short answer, it has taken collaborations and looking sometimes even outside, our own consortium to come up with something that we think would be good. But that said, we still have to defend it, before regulators, and it has to be presented to, of course, reviewers who could also maybe critique it. But we'll be quite confident that I think it will be good enough. But we'll also have to understand that this is a first of its kind, and so, time will tell. So those are the challenges. So when it comes to the community, so the communities, probably don't discuss with them trial design, but maybe the stakeholders that we'll discuss trial design with are the regulators. And like all things, once we have something ready to adopt, we swing it by them and try to see whether there's any input, that they could put. We use that model when we were putting up our infrastructure and a lot of things. It was more of consultative engagements with them that we take and share our plans and the kind of input, and in the end, we come up with something that's more refined and that will need, less adjustment once we start. But I think that's what you face when you're a pioneering group.
Okay, thank you so much on that. Now, my question now goes to Austin. I believe you are the pioneer in developing this construct of the gene drive that is being rolled out into various countries where it's being tested. And we thank you for that. But the question that I want you to address is, how can this technology transfer, or how should it be transferred in the African settings? Because you have already started transferring that technology to African settings. And what are the challenges or the issues that are coming up with where you are actually setting it up? So maybe what could be the challenges that we could be able to address, and then we can be able to know exactly how to fast track that transfer of technology.
Thanks very much. So as Jonathan mentioned, it's pioneering first-in-class technology, and so there's a lot of education that's needed. You know, we're learning, our partners in Uganda are learning, and then they've got to, what they're learning, they need to be telling and informing the regulators and the stakeholders more broadly about what the technology is, what it isn't, what we hope it can do, what it's not going to be able to do, etc., and so forth, and listen very carefully to find out what their concerns might be, and then that can. Sometimes we can address those concerns immediately. Sometimes we have to go back and do some experiments to try and understand whether this is going to be a real concern or not. So there's a lot of dialogue, and over time, trust building, and that's the major process, a modus operandi, by which one can bring this technology to a country, I think. The locals, it can't be, I'm a professor at a university, it's not me going to be doing this in the UK. So it's not going to be me doing this in Africa, it's a matter of partnering with appropriate African institutions who are going to be the ones actually taking this forward.
Okay, thank you so much. Now, let's turn to Friendrose. You have been talking about African controversies. It's African controversies. And you have said the voice of the people needs to be heard. And if the voice of the people needs to be heard, we wonder, how do the people participate in this decision making? Because like in the presentation you had in the morning, is these people do not talk to themselves. We come and talk about all this in conferences and in other workshops, but the person who is infected is not being heard. How do we ensure that the African voices are heard and participate in decision making on the gene drive interventions?
Thank you very much, Prof. This is a difficult question. So, when I was responding to Amelia's question, I did say that there are 2 points to this story. Number one is the people with the opportunity, like us, need to realize that there are voices behind us that might be different, that might have different opinions. So my colleague Lina Finda is not here, but she did an interesting study many years ago in Tanzania. She went to the village and asked people, which malaria intervention would you like to have? A very general question. And she ranked these things, and the villagers mentioned many things. So she counted the numbers and the percentages and figured out that people want good housing. This is what the villagers told her. They want good housing. And then I think the next thing was, I don't know what it was, but gene drives were like at the bottom, because people didn't know about the technology. But Lena also went to the government officials, and she asked the same question. And none of these guys wanted to listen to the idea of housing improvement. If you raise housing improvement, they say it's too expensive. We cannot do it. It cannot be prioritized. So, in other words, what the people want is not always the same thing that the decision makers think is doable or is right. Now, how do we reach those people? In most countries, people have representatives. And so I think reaching them through their representatives is okay. And we can also act as representatives if we realize that these voices are different and we should prioritize them to a certain degree. The second way is to expand these conversations, not necessarily for purposes of seeking their decision-making opinion, but rather to understand their concerns, because you can codify these concerns into your development process. For example, there are communities that live in islands, and they might say that we don't want replacement drives. We don't want mosquitoes here. We don't want mosquitoes. So if you go to these guys and you say, no, we want to release mosquitoes, yeah? They might prefer a suppression drive. This is not to say that you're letting them decide, but rather you're understanding their opinion, their concerns, and you're bringing this into the design stage, in the decision-making stage. And I think this is important that all of us need to do that. The decision-making table is not that big that everybody can sit around it, but I think we must realize that the voices do differ. Thank you so much, bro.
Thank you so much. My final question now comes to Frederick. You have talked about your work on genetic engineering for a long time, since in the 90s. And I wonder how we can be able to enhance this kind of technology in Africa, and how we should be able to start building it up so that it is accepted from the very early beginning, so that as we move and get new innovations, some of these things are undertaken. Do you have a way that we should be able to move in this direction?
Thanks for the question. First, I'd like to clarify that I'm not actually a molecular engineer myself. I've worked on population genetics, but that being said, I have ideas about capacity building and how things could change in future. So I think all the projects are trying to really involve the local institutions in the process, or at least the understanding of genetic engineering. That being said, depending on the operational infrastructure or the planning of those projects, they may be better able to involve institutions in the early stages of the planning of genetic engineering. So if you're familiar with the process, you need to have skills in bioinformatics. You need to master quite a few techniques before you can design your constructs. Then you need the infrastructures and the techniques to modify your mosquitoes. You need the screening, which we talked about. There are a variety of steps that are required, highly skilled people and infrastructure. So if we want to have genetic engineering taking place in Africa, and Africa kind of owning those new concepts and the design of the constructs themselves, the designs of the gene drive, we need to kind of really rethink the way we approach the project, and we sell those projects to the funders to begin with. So that will require a little bit of rethinking and tweaking. I still believe that there's a very big place for North-South collaborations, with hopefully more and more South-South collaborations on those very important topics. It's moving along progressively on the back of the developers' efforts to push that agenda. And I'm really optimistic that it will come little by little as we have more and more African individuals also involved in those projects and learning those skills. So it's not going to be very quick because you have to convince the funders to give the monies directly to African developers. You need a whole generation of scientists to be trained in very complex areas. Like I said, bioinformatics, molecular engineering and that. You know the complexity of supply chains and getting the reagents in Africa. There's a host of difficulties to overcome. But I think, as everything else, which is progressing nicely, we will get there eventually. Austin, did you want to comment?
Okay, thank you so much. Now, the one final question to all of you, and anyone can be able to start answering these particular questions, is we have two constructs here. A suppression and replacement. And assuming that all these two constructs are very successful, how do we convince the governments which ones to select from? And how can we be able to scale them through this? Because we are assuming now this technology is coming to a situation where it is going to be taken up and scaled up. So among the two constructs that are already being tested, how do we convince the governments on which ones to take and which one not to take? And if so, how do we go about that? Anyone who can start?
Well, I can say a few words. I think most of us have something to say about that. So we have to remember that the gene drive, the set of gene drive tools that are being proposed offer a very versatile solutions for a very, very complex situation with malaria. You mentioned, this morning we mentioned there's residual transmission, there's areas with very high mosquito density and a lot of malaria transmission. There are all kinds of different settings. There's also a dimension that we don't want to talk about right now, is that like bed nets, it's possible that resistance arises to some of the gene drives. Therefore, we need several tools to be available. So there is a lot of needs for having several approaches available. And hopefully in the future, it'll become a bit clearer which one works best or which ones people want. That's my take on it. But probably.
Yeah, I agree with that. So it's too early, and until we've done field releases, we're not going to be able to make fine comparisons between them. And my own opinion, like Frederick alluded to, is there's likely to be good synergies between them. The one is going to make the other perform better, and that's vice versa, particularly around the issue of epidemiological impacts and of dealing with resistance. So I don't see, there might be a sequencing issue, which one you do first, but I don't see that one should be trying at this point to say, oh, one is better than the other, because I think we should be looking to develop both and full steam, well, okay, doing both, and it's quite likely that we're going to want to have both. Malaria is a particularly pernicious, difficult disease to be dealing with, and we want to get it to zero, and we're going to need every tool we've got.
I agree. I think the only addition here is there's going to be issues about communicating this to your people. So when I was still Director of Science at Ifakara, before Transmission Zero started, there was the argument that maybe Ifakara should make a decision very early on as to whether they are going to work on suppression or replacement and stick to whatever the choice is. That discussion didn't continue, but I remember it very well. And the point here was that if you start working on two, and then you go to policymaker conversations or conversations with the people, and on day one you tell them, our aim is to reduce mosquito populations. So we want to release these mosquitoes that will crush the populations. And the next scientist from the same institution comes and says, no, our aim is to release mosquitoes that will stay in the environment for a long time. And there might be a difficulty with communication. And I think that's the only thing that is a problem. Like we said in the morning, in high burden areas, you could do your suppression drives to bring the burden down. But if your interest is to sustain zero or to maintain or to prevent reinvasion, your better option here is a replacement drive. Because then you don't want to be constantly releasing in these small vector populations. So there's a sense in which you can use a suppression and then continue with a replacement in perpetuity. But that is sequencing, like Austin said. Now, still, I think that if people are going to be working on more than one at a time, they need a really, really good communication strategy here. And this is something that will catch up with us anyway. And as you know, Transmission Zero is working in Lake Victoria. My friend here is working very close to Lake Victoria as well. And we don't know the speed at which this will happen, but at least because I'm not a developer, I can imagine a situation where these things collide. And so we have to imagine this process ahead of time and think about whether the result will be a good result or a bad result, but more importantly, how do we communicate it to the people?
Just to add, that's a very important question, and the good thing is that discussion and thinking is happening among developers. It's also sort of encourage us to collaborate, because these are two different technologies that they will be released in the same environment where the disease is. And the collaboration part has become extremely important. As Fredos indicated, I think in terms of communicating, and this is yet to be tested, but it's important to say we're developing gene drive mosquitoes and a different way of developing it, and it can either be making mosquito immune or basically crushing them completely. And who is doing that? Any institution working on malaria in Africa has an opportunity to work around that space. And at times we'll find ourselves that we are working on those kind of technology. At the moment, this looks like separate techniques, but within developers' space, they're also thinking where you can combine the two. So you end up probably having a construct that actually can be able to do two things at a time. So in terms of communication, it's extremely important on our best to do that. Thank you.
I think my colleagues have said everything, but maybe what I'll just add is that maybe the first communication to try and pass out is to tell probably the government, but the malaria control managers probably know this, that it would be naive to think you can control malaria by just one tool. So from the outset, the mindset should be, you need to have in your toolkit as many tools as you can. Now, to deploy, you can choose one at a time, but you have to be prepared to either sequence or even, change them as you go here.